So this video is going to focus on the First Amendment, which is probably the most famous of the amendments. It protects like your five basic fundamental freedoms as an American: your freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. This video is going to focus just on sort of like the religious component of the First Amendment. So the first part of the First Amendment deals with religion, right? And it's actually made up of like two separate little clauses. So the first part, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, basically makes the point that our government can't sort of endorse a religion, favor a religion, promote a religion, force people to follow a certain religion. That there has to be that separation of like church and state. Because of the wording, it's referred to as the Establishment Clause. Like our government can't establish like an official religion. So, like an example of that would be the famous. This is not one of the mandatory cases, but obviously of local interest, the Abington versus Shep case in 1963, in which common tradition in the like 50s up through the early 1960s was essentially to have students engage in Bible reading in public high schools throughout the country. This wasn't just an Abington thing. This was common throughout most of the country. And there was a student, Ellery Shemp, whose family argued that this was a violation of the Establishment Clause, that a publicly funded school district was endorsing religion by forcing the students to read the Bible, and that essentially this was a violation of the Establishment Clause. And the Supreme Court agreed, and Bible reading was removed throughout all public high schools in the country, not just Abington. So that's an example of Establishment Clause case, right? And then the Supreme Court often has to deal with cases involving this. So another non-mandatory case, but Lemon v. Kurtzman in 1971 established what the Supreme Court still sort of uses today to decide if the government's actions violate the Establishment Clause. It's called the Lemon test. Think of it like as like guidelines. If somebody's challenging something the government's doing as a violation of the Establishment Clause, the argument is like, okay, is it for a secular purpose, like a non-religious purpose, or is the law intending to be involved with religion, right? Is the point of the government's actions to advance a particular religion or to hurt a particular religion? And then, is whatever the government's accused of doing, is it involving like a long-term sort of like messy entanglement between religion and government? And if the Supreme Court answers yes to any of these questions or no, depending on how they look at it, it guides whether or not they think the government is violating the Establishment Clause. So you can look at this in different ways. Like, should taxpayer money be used to provide busing to like private schools? The Supreme Court argued that this was not right a violation of the Establishment Clause. That allowing private school kids to use buses provided by the local public school district and tax money was not trying to advance a particular religion. It's just trying to get the kids to school like safely. It's like a secular purpose. It's not a religious thing. You're not advancing or hurting like one particular like religious group. However, so they've allowed taxpayer money to be used to bus to private schools. But like, should taxpayer money be used to pay the salaries of private school teachers? Supreme Court ruled that like that was too much of an involvement between government and religion. So they struck that down, right? So like they sort of think differently on this depending on how you look at it. And then the second part is referred to as the free exercise clause, because not only can Congress not establish their own religion, they can't prohibit you from like freely participating in your religion. So this is referred to as the free exercise clause, again, because of the wording in the amendment. So like an example of this would be Burwell versus Hobby Lobby in 2014, where essentially part of the Obamacare law that went into place required companies with certain numbers of employees to provide healthcare for its employees, and as part of that healthcare were like contraception coverage that companies would have to provide. Essentially, Hobby Lobby argued that they were opposed to having to cover contraception, that the idea of contraception violated certain like religious beliefs that the company believed in, and essentially they sued and they won, basically saying that like having to force them to provide contraception coverage at the expense of a violation of their religious beliefs was preventing like the people that ran the company from exercising freely their own religious beliefs. So again, you see like the free exercise clause, and you also see like the establishment clause. Two of the cases that you have to know that we will talk about in more detail relate to these. These are the mandatory cases. Engle v. Vital, which revolved around whether or not schools could sort of like force their students to say a prayer, public school students, at the beginning of each day. And that was challenged under the Establishment Clause. And then Wisconsin v. Yoder, which was in case involving Amish families that didn't want to send their students to school beyond eighth grade, essentially violating Wisconsin laws that required their students to attend like longer. That involved a dispute over is that preventing Amish families from like exercising their own religious beliefs. So again, I'll talk about this in greater detail. But in order to understand the religious component of the First Amendment, you have to look at both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise